Today is the 15th of September, and this is the 57th time we are speaking on the Majjhima Nikaya Suttas. And tonight we come to Sutta 138, Uddesavibhanga Sutta, the exposition of a summary. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There the Blessed One addressed the monks thus, "Monks, Venerable Sir," they replied. The Blessed One said, "Monks, I shall teach you a summary and an exposition. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, Venerable Sir," the monks replied. The Blessed One said, "Monks, a monk should examine things in such a way that while he is examining them, his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally, nor stuck internally. And by not clinging, he does not become agitated. If his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally, nor stuck internally, and if by not clinging he does not become agitated, then for him there is no origination of suffering, of birth, aging and death in the future." Sorry for a moment. So here basically the Buddha says to end the round of rebirths, the monk's consciousness must not be distracted and not stuck internally and not clinging so that he does not become agitated. So basically three things. That is what the Blessed One said. Having said this, the Sublime One rose from his seat and went into his dwelling. Then soon after the Blessed One had gone, the monks considered, "Now friends, the Blessed One has risen from his seat and gone into his dwelling after giving a summary in brief, without expounding the detailed meaning. Now who will expound this in detail?" Then they considered, "The Venerable Mahakachana is praised by the teacher and esteemed by his wise companions in the holy life. He is capable of expounding the detailed meaning. Suppose we went to him and asked him the meaning of this." So as before in Sutta 133, they went to the Venerable Mahakachana and asked him to explain this saying of the Buddha. Then he said, "You should have asked the Buddha. The Buddha is like the hardwood of the Bodhi tree, and he's humble. He says he's cannot compare to the Buddha, but they still asked him to explain. Then he said, "Then listen, friends, and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, friend," the monks replied. The Venerable Mahakachana said, "How, friends, is consciousness called distracted and scattered externally? Here, when a monk has seen a form with the eye, if his consciousness follows after the sign of form, is tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of form, is fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of form, then his consciousness is called distracted and scattered externally. Similarly, when he has heard a sound with the ear, smelt an odor, tasted a flavor, touched a tangible, cognized a mind object, if his consciousness follows after the sign of the external sense objects, is tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of the external sense objects, is fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of the external sense objects, then his consciousness is called distracted and scattered externally. And how, friends, is consciousness not distracted and scattered externally? Here, when a monk has seen a form with the eye, if his consciousness does not follow after the sign of form, is not tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of form, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of form, then his consciousness is called not distracted and scattered externally. When he has heard a sound with the ear, smelt an odor, tasted a flavor, touched a tangible, cognized a mind object, if his consciousness does not follow after the sign of the external sense object, is not tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of the external sense object, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of the external sense object, then his consciousness is called not distracted and scattered externally. Stop here for a moment. So here Kachana says that if this monk he sees either a form or hears a sound or smells an odor, and he follows after the object is gratified by the object, then his consciousness is called distracted and scattered externally. For example, somebody say this monk he sees a beautiful girl and his attention is drawn by this beautiful object. Then he pays attention. So his mind is distracted. Instead of putting it, the Buddha says that our mind should always be on the four objects of sati, four objects of recollection, the body, feeling, mind, and Dhamma, and not on external sense objects. External sense objects are the bait of Mara. Mara is always trying to catch us at the six sense doors. So if he does not pay too much attention to forms, sounds, smells, tastes, touch, and thoughts, then his mind is collected. His mind is focused. So it is not distracted and scattered externally. And how, friends, is the mind called stuck internally? Here quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. A monk enters upon and abides in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with delight and pleasure born of seclusion. If his consciousness follows after the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, is tied and shackled by gratification in the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, then his mind is called stuck internally. Again, with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, a monk enters upon and abides in the second jhana, which has self-confidence and singleness of mind, without applied and sustained thought, with delight and pleasure born of concentration. If his consciousness follows after the delight and pleasure born of concentration, then his mind is called stuck internally. Again, with the fading away as well of delight, a monk abides in equanimity, and mindful and fully aware, still feeling pleasure with the body. He enters upon and abides in the third jhana, on account of which noble ones announce, he has a pleasant abiding, who has equanimity and is mindful. If his consciousness follows after the equanimity, then his mind is called stuck internally. Again, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, and with the previous disappearance of joy and grief, a monk enters upon and abides in the fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure, and purity and utter purity of mindfulness and equanimity. If his consciousness follows after the neither pain nor pleasure, is tied and shackled by gratification in the neither pain nor pleasure, is fettered by the fetter of gratification in the neither pain nor pleasure, then his mind is called stuck internally. That is how the mind is called stuck internally. I'll stop here for a moment. So here it is explained that when this monk attains the first jhana, and then if he clings to the delight and pleasure, piti and sukha in the first jhana, then his mind is called stuck internally. Similarly, in the second jhana, if his mind clings to the delight and pleasure, so he cannot progress, he's also said to be stuck internally. And in the third jhana, if he clings to equanimity, he is stuck internally. In the fourth jhana, he clings to this neither pain nor pleasure. This neither pain nor pleasure is also equanimity. So you see, in the third jhana, the equanimity is quite pronounced. In the fourth jhana, it is even more pronounced, because in the definition of the fourth jhana, it is said now that when one enters the fourth jhana and abides in the fourth jhana, he has utter purity of mindfulness and equanimity. So, if a monk attains the jhanas and he clings to it, then he cannot progress. So he is said to be stuck internally. So there are some monks who always talk a lot about this, saying that you can easily get attached to the jhanas, but this is not true, because in the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 44, it is said, if you have a look, it's on page 402. Page 402, the previous page 401, it says, the underlying tendency to lust underlies pleasant feeling. The underlying tendency to aversion underlies painful feeling. But then he also says, does the underlying tendency to lust underlie all pleasant feeling? And then this Dhammadina, this Arahant says, the underlying tendency to lust does not underlie all pleasant feeling. 28. Okay. The underlying tendency to lust does not have to be abandoned in regard to all pleasant feeling. And then here, friend Visakha, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, a monk enters upon and abides in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with delight and pleasure born of seclusion. With that, he abandons lust, and the underlying tendency to lust does not underlie that. So you see here, in the first jhana, even though it's a very pleasant state, you have this piti and sukha, which is delight and pleasure or happiness. But in some other sutta, the Buddha says, even this piti and sukha, delight and pleasure, is a subtle perception. It's not as strong as later books say. Later books say this piti can be overwhelming. But in the suttas, the Buddha says piti and sukha is just a subtle perception. So also when the person enters the first jhana, the mind is focused, strong. So here it says very clearly, there is no underlying tendency to lust for it. Then why does a monk cling to the first jhana? You see, in the one of the previous suttas we read, the Buddha says that he always tells his disciples to surmount whatever attainment they have and go to a higher level and keep going until they have finished their work. So in that sutta, the Buddha says that when a monk attains the first jhana, he should not stay at that stage. He should surmount it and go to the next stage, which is the second jhana. And then after the second jhana, he should surmount the second jhana again and go to the third jhana. After attaining the third jhana, he should surmount it again and go to the fourth jhana. After he attains the fourth jhana, there are two ways to go. One is to attain higher jhanas, which is the arupas, arupa jhana. So after that, the Buddha says he should surmount the fourth rupa jhana and attain the base of infinite space. And then after that, the Buddha says, surmount that and attain the base of infinite consciousness, surmount that and attain the base of nothingness, surmount that again and attain the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And even that high stage, the Buddha says, surmount it and attain the cessation of perception and feeling. Then when a monk attains cessation of perception and feeling, and when he comes out of it, he becomes liberated. The other way, in some other suttas, it is explained, after attaining the fourth jhana, the Buddha says to attain the recollection of past lives is one of the abhinyas. You can consider it as a psychic power. The ability to recollect many, many lifetimes, thousands of lifetimes, and even world cycles of lifetime. Then after that, surmount that and attain the divine eye and see beings passing away and taking rebirth according to karma vipaka and understand the working of karma vipaka. Then after that, use the memory of the past dhamma that he has learned. Then the monk should contemplate the four noble truths and attain liberation. So whatever stage you attain, the Buddha says, keep on surmounting it until you have attained liberation, which is the destruction of the asavas, the taints. So this one, where a monk attains the first jhana and is tied and shackled by gratification of the first jhana, this normally happens to external sect ascetics. External sect ascetics, when they have attained these jhanas, they don't know how to progress after that, because they don't know the Dhamma. They can't attain the various Aryan stages, so they get stuck there. So that is why they stay in that level. So that is called stuck internally. That means not progressing. Stuck at that stage. So similarly with the second jhana, third jhana, and the fourth jhana. And how, friends, is the mind called not stuck internally? Here, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. A monk enters upon and abides in the first jhana. If his consciousness does not follow after the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, is not tied and shackled by gratification in the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the delight and pleasure born of seclusion, then his mind is called not stuck internally. Again, with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, a monk enters upon and abides in the second jhana. If his consciousness does not follow after the delight and pleasure born of concentration, then his mind is called not stuck internally. Again, with the fading away as well of delight, a monk enters upon and abides in the third jhana. If his consciousness does not follow after the equanimity, then his mind is called not stuck internally. Again, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, a monk enters upon and abides in the fourth jhana. If his consciousness does not follow after the neither pain nor pleasure, is not tied and shackled by gratification in the neither pain nor pleasure, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the neither pain nor pleasure, then his mind is called not stuck internally. That is how the mind is called not stuck internally. So this follows from before. So here, if this monk is a Buddhist monk, a disciple of the Buddha, that having attained the jhanas, he does not get stuck there because he does not stay at that level. He goes progressively higher and higher stages until he is liberated. So he does not cling to all these jhanas. How, friends, is there agitation due to clinging? Here, an untaught ordinary person who has no regard for noble ones and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, who has no regard for true men and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, regards material form as self, or self as possessed of material form, or material form as in self, or self as in material form. That material form of his changes and becomes otherwise. With the change and becoming otherwise of that material form, his consciousness is preoccupied with the change of material form. Agitated mental states born of preoccupation with the change of material form arise together and remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is obsessed, he is anxious, distressed and concerned, and due to clinging he becomes agitated. Similarly, he regards feeling, perception, volition, consciousness as self, or as belonging to self, or self as in the aggregates, or the aggregates as in the self. Those aggregates of his change and becomes otherwise. With the change and becoming otherwise of those aggregates, his consciousness is preoccupied with the change of the aggregates. Agitated states of mind born of preoccupation with the change of the aggregates arise together and remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is obsessed, he is anxious, distressed and concerned, and due to clinging he becomes agitated. That is how there is agitation due to clinging. Stop here for a moment. Here the Buddha says that untaught ordinary person, a putujana, who doesn't know the Dhamma, he tends to cling to the five aggregates. But the five aggregates, which is basically body and mind, here he says the five aggregates are material form or body, and feeling, perception, volition and consciousness. So this body and mind, these five aggregates are basically body and mind. So when this body and mind changes, then he becomes agitated because he clings to the body and the mind. So he becomes distressed and agitated. That is how there is agitation due to clinging. And how, friends, is there non-agitation due to non-clinging? Here a well-taught noble disciple who has regard for noble ones and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, who has regard for true men and is skilled and disciplined in their Dhamma, does not regard material form or body as self, or self as possessed of material form, or material form as in the self, or self as in material form. That material form of his changes and becomes otherwise. With the change and becoming otherwise of that material form, his consciousness is not preoccupied with the change of material form. Agitated mental states, born of preoccupation with the change of material form, do not arise together and remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is not obsessed, he is not anxious, distressed and concerned, and due to non-clinging, he does not become agitated. Similarly, he does not regard feeling, perception, volition and consciousness as self, or self as possessed of these aggregates, or the aggregates as in the self, or the self as in these aggregates. Those aggregates of his changes and becomes otherwise. With the change and becoming otherwise of those aggregates, his consciousness is not preoccupied with the change of the aggregates. Agitated mental states born of preoccupation with the change of the aggregates do not arise together and remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is not obsessed, he is not anxious, distressed and concerned. And due to non-clinging, he does not become agitated. That is how there is non-agitation due to non-clinging. Stop here for a moment. So here an Aryan disciple, having understood the Dhamma, does not cling to the five aggregates. So when the five aggregates change, as they must change, then he does not become agitated. Friends, when the Blessed One rose from his seat and went into his dwelling, after giving a summary in brief without expounding the detailed meaning, that is, monks, a monk should examine things in such a way that while he is examining them, his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally, nor stuck internally, and by not clinging he does not become agitated. If his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally, nor stuck internally, and if by not clinging he does not become agitated, then for him there is no origination of suffering, of birth, aging and death in the future. I understand the detailed meaning of this summary to be thus. Now friends, if you wish, go to the Blessed One and ask him about the meaning of this. As the Blessed One explains it to you, so you should remember it. Then the monks, having delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Mahakachana's words, rose from their seats and went to the Blessed One. After paying homage to him, they sat down at one side and told the Blessed One all that had taken place after he had left, adding, "Then, Venerable Sir, we went to the Venerable Mahakachana and asked him about the meaning. The Venerable Mahakachana expounded the meaning to us with these terms, statements and phrases." And the Buddha said, "Mahakachana is wise, monks. Mahakachana has great wisdom. If you had asked me the meaning of this, I would have explained it to you in the same way that Mahakachana has explained it. Such is its meaning, and so you should remember it." That is what the Blessed One said. The monks were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. That's the end of the sutta. So here, basically, this sutta is talking about 3 steps to enlightenment. One is not to allow the mind to be scattered out to external sense objects and not to be stuck at various levels of meditation. If you cling to various stages of meditation, then it cannot progress. And then also, the third thing is not to cling to the 5 aggregates, which are basically body and mind. So if you don't cling to the 5 aggregates, when they change as they will, then you will not become agitated. And that is the way to practice to end the cycle of birth, aging and death.